Jane Howsham, who's the manager of University of Hertfordshire Press.
Thanks so much, Philip. And thank you so much for having us here this evening. I'm here with my colleague, Chris Dunkley, from the press. And the book we're here to celebrate tonight is the 10th volume in our series Exploration in Local and Regional History. Now, actually, the series goes back further than 10 volumes because it's the continuation of a much older series of what were called occasional papers, once published by the University of Leicester and their Centre for English Local History. And that started back in 1952. So I feel it's quite venerable now. As a series, it's fairly wide-ranging in the topics, but so far it's mostly focused on regions of England. So we're really delighted that Craig's book takes us to medieval Wales and uses landscape history, in particular the placing of native Welsh castles in the landscape, to shed light on the politics of the princes of Gwynedd. The series has a particular focus on landscape history, but I really like this kind of sidebar, that side direction that Craig's book has taken us in. It really has opened out the series, and that's brilliant. And we're really thrilled to be launching it under the auspices of the Mortimer History Society, which I've now discovered is an absolutely wonderful, thriving history society, and I'm so impressed by it. It's fantastic.
Thank you, Jane.
So Craig Owen Jones is a very, very lively academic with unusually broad research interests, as well as medieval Welsh history. He's active in the fields of history of music, sports history, science fiction studies, popular music, and film and television studios. He's already published an impressive amount of work right across all those areas of interest, from Doctor Who to Prestatyn Cricket Club. But this book about the Welsh princes and their castles represents work to which he's deeply committed. During the period of its writing and production, he not only weathered the COVID storm, but he also welcomed a new baby into his family right at the height of the pandemic. And I don't think he would deny that he was under some pressure during all of that in both those respects. But here is his new book, testament to his commitment and his determination. So I know that you'll join me in congratulating Craig on the new book. And now I'm delighted to introduce him to talk to you about his research. Over to you, Craig.
So, I'm going to begin today with a quote, ironically enough, by Jonathan Meades, who it troubles me not at all to say I have a great respect for. As a teenager in rural Flintshire in the 1990s, I used to set the VCR for his documentaries on BBC Two on all kinds of subjects, principally art history and architecture. It really opened up a whole new world for me. So it, to put it mildly, dismayed me to find him launching such an ill-principled and just a profound misunderstanding of the Welsh language in the broadside which he launched against it in last month's issue of The Critic, My Responses in Writing. But he did have this to say in 1997, and I think this expresses a truism: if something is forever like something else, it is never itself. And I think we are particularly guilty of holding the native Welsh castles, the castles of the native Welsh princes, to a mirror which gives a strange reflection, because of the fact that they tend to be cheek by jowl with Edward I's castles, which are, there is no doubt, masterpieces of medieval architecture, and more or less any castle would look puny by comparison. So I think they have been done down by association. They've not benefited by that association. But it's also true that a certain mindset has been in place for many years now, and it's what prompted me to write the book. The fact that so many commentators have seen them as oddities, relevances, or even worse. I mean, I'm cherry picking here. This is a particularly egregious example, which I found in the archives that Llywelyn was almost useless, a medieval mistake. I don't believe that was written by a professional historian, but it did get published. And that sort of attitude towards the Welsh princes' castles has obtained for the longest time. I devote some time in the book to saying why. A lot of the blame can be laid at the foot of Wilfred Hempstall, who in 1928 was responsible for writing a very important and well-received paper called Llywelyn Castle and the Welsh Castle Plan, in which that really represented the first sustained attempt to describe native Welsh castle architecture. It's just unfortunate, Hemp was speaking kindly about the castles, but he chose Llywelyn as his beginning because it had just been excavated. And so these comments which he made about what is admittedly a very oddly sited castle tended to get disseminated and repeated with reference to all native Welsh castles everywhere. And so this has not done us any favors. The native Welsh castles are a strange bunch. They're a mixture. They contain all kinds of architectural idiosyncrasies, and it is difficult to impose any sort of meaningful typology on them. The typology that I use in the book, I group native Welsh castle building into 3 phases. I advanced with some misgivings, and that's the reason why there is quite a lengthy disclaimer at the front of the book, which is to state that the native Welsh princes certainly didn't conceive of their castles in this way, but perhaps it will help us to impose some sort of meaning on them, to think of them as having been created or refurbished or extended according to different guiding principles, different ideological principles, depending on who was doing it and when they were doing it. The trouble that we have is that so many of our analyses begin with a mindset which owes a great deal to something like this. This is the sort of map of native Welsh castles which you see in many guidebooks and popular history books and all that kind of thing. And the trouble with it is that it doesn't say everything that you think it might say. I refer to it in the book as the tyranny of the map. When you just see all these castles and fortifications kind of dumped on the map like this, we don't get a feel for chronology. We don't get a feel for who built them. We don't get a feel for what their functions were at a particular time. And it's very easy to fall into the, if you're not really familiar with Coulson and the strand of thinking which is obtained in castle studies since the 1970s, that castles function as important indicators of prestige and so on and so forth. It's easy to think of these all as military fortifications in the first instance, and that was their sole role. It's certainly not the case. What I wanted to do was to demonstrate the various roles that Welsh castles had, and to present a sort of model for them, which demonstrates how they evolved over time. And in this regard, we are hobbled, we ought to point out at the beginning, by the fact that we don't have much in the way of historical documentation. We have very, very few references to these castles in use in the 13th century. It's the reason why John Kenyon many years ago referred to Wales as the poor man of Welsh castle studies. It really has hobbled our understanding. So what I'd like to do to start with is just to talk about some of the ways in which the native Welsh castles have been described in the past and the sorts of criticisms that have been leveled at their authors. This is R.R. Davies, the late R.R. Davies, who wrote such remarkable work. I'm sure lots of people will be familiar with his splendid biography of Owen Glyndŵr. 25 years ago, really splendid work. And this is what he has to say about the castles. In design and construction, they were very inferior in comparison with English castles built in Wales in this period. Their overall design often appears haphazard. Little attempt was made to integrate towers and curtain walls into a sustained defense system, and the quality of their masonry was frequently poor. And we have similar sorts of pronouncements from Stephen Fryer rather later. Their most characteristic feature is an apsidal, or a rectangular tower, often joined to an insubstantial and irregular curtain wall. Bearing in mind the superior siege capability of the English, it is surprising that the Welsh clung for so long to the vulnerable rectilinear tower. For those who aren't familiar with this, if you've got a square tower or a rectangular tower, the corners are vulnerable to sapping and undermining. So that's why the round tower starts to gain in currency in the 13th century. But both of these viewpoints are very much rooted in understanding of Anglo-Norman castle architecture and Anglo-Norman ways of waging warfare. They're not terribly useful if we want to apply them to castles which, by and large, were placed in the sorts of positions in the landscape which would make Anglo-Norman builders of castles shudder, usually hilltops, inaccessible remote places, and so forth. A lot of the time, I think the native Welsh princes didn't have to worry about particular types of warfare being waged against their castles because the terrain simply didn't allow it, but we'll come to that as we go. In any case, here's the typology which I suggested, and I described the first phase of native Welsh masonry castle building as expeditionary. I group 4 castles under this, erected as far as we can determine by Llywelyn the first, Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, in the first 25 years or so of his reign. And to my mind, they are there, the reason for their existence is to delimit territory and to express Llywelyn's power to rival lords. We have to bear in mind that the Welsh princes were constantly having to rebuild. There is a continuity in terms of chronology. You can actually sort of see how one person passes the princeship up to the next, and so on and so forth, much as is the case with the kings of Scots or the kings of England. But what we don't have is continuity of administrative machinery and so on and so forth. The way in which royal government functioned seems to have varied a great deal, and every prince, it would appear, has largely had to sort of begin from the ground up. And so when Llywelyn I's reign began, ostensibly in 1194 after the Battle of Aberconwy, what sort of royal governmental institutions did he inherit? We don't know, but it seems that perhaps not many. And it also seems to be the case that he had to fight to establish his legitimacy. There was a battle at Coedanau the same year. David ab Owain was not expelled from Gwynedd until the late 1190s. There was a lengthy period where Llywelyn's legitimacy was in dispute. And so I think it's important that we contextualize these early castles against that struggle. What Llywelyn is doing at that time, it seems to me, is bulwarking his own legitimacy. I'm the prince. Of course I'm the prince. Take a look at this castle that I've just built. Isn't it better than yours? That kind of approach to castle building. So they're there to exert authority over the immediate surroundings, the immediate neighborhood, but they're also there in order to make a point. In the later part of his reign, we have what I describe as his second phase of castle building. I describe these as corporate castles, following the work of Rachel Swallow. Dr. Swallow's in the room, so I'll just say hi, who has done a great deal of work at this time, I believe, is particularly concentrating on castles in the northeastern March, in Cheshire and such, but wrote an excellent piece called Gateways to Power some years ago on the relationship between Llywelyn ap Iorwerth and Ranulph, the Earl of Chester. The two men were on excellent terms after 1218, up until Earl Ranulph's death. And the point I make in the book is that from that point onwards, Llywelyn is rubbing shoulders with quite a few of the great and the good in Anglo-Norman society, and is starting to make his presence felt without Wales. And so these corporate castles, they're not there in order to express his legitimacy. They're there to express how important he is, his prestige, his power and wealth, and not merely to his princelings and minor rulers in Wales, but also to those outside of Wales, which is why we find, I would suggest to you, Criccyth and the refortification of Deganwy occurring in places where they're extremely visible. If you've been to Criccyth, you really ought to. It's a wonderful castle perched on the northern shores of Cardigan Bay, and would be visible, and is visible, but 20, 25 miles to the south, and Deganwy similarly. So that I feel distinguishes those castles. And the other way that they are distinguished is that they're just bigger. And Criccyth, Abera, Deganwy, these are very, very large castles. by native Welsh standards, far larger than the clutch of expeditionary castles that he built at the beginning of his reign. And then we come to Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Llywelyn II, Llywelyn the Last, as he used to be called. And this is the one part of the history of 13th century Wales where I do believe that castles are actually being erected in the first instance for military purposes. What Llywelyn was trying to do was to render the Principality defensible. And I'm aware that this is a somewhat contentious thing to say, which is why I advance it somewhat tentatively in the book. But I think there are indications that this is the case, and we'll discuss why a little bit later in tonight's lecture. But the point, the most important point there, I think, is that they're larger, they're quite sophisticated, they have large numbers of towers, and we also might look at their location. They're dotted down the eastern border of Llywelyn's principality, and I think that's instructive. So we'll start off with emplacement, and I forget who it was who said it, but or wrote it rather. It's in the book. These castles were expensive. Building a masonry castle cost a lot of money, a lot of time and resources. Rulers would have thought long and hard before doing so, and so I don't think we can really make the sort of breezy comment that a lot of these castles were built according to whim. I don't think they were. And a map like this just demonstrates the point. Look at Dolwyddelan's positioning there. It is right at the centre of this nexus of routes going in and out of southern Gwynedd. It's at the foot of Bwlch y Gorddinan, the Crimea Pass, which is down to the bottom left on the map. There was a road up to Penmachno, a road mirroring the Afon Lleder, and we also have the pilgrimage route, Bwlch yr Ahediad. All of these routes sort of culminate in the area of Dolwyddelan, and indeed it was important in earlier eras, because less than half a mile away we find Tomen Castell, Llywelyn ap Iorwerth's reputed birthplace. That was a motte with what would appear to be a timber-framed castle on the top. There is a relative lack of masonry. There's some masonry remains there, but not that much. So the suggestion is that maybe the foundation was set in stone, and then the timber castle was erected above it. In any case, Llywelyn obviously saw fit to fortify this location, and that would have served as an important reminder to anybody getting over the Crimea Pass and heading down. The first thing they would find once they reached the valley floor would have been a large masonry tower facing them. And so I think we can take that as indicative of his interest in proclaiming his presence, his arrival in Gwynedd to those round and about who may have saw fit to challenge his position. Then we have Dolbadan's position as well, just next to that sort of narrow isthmus between Llynpadan and Llynperis, and that is monitoring traffic through the Llanberis Pass. We'll come to that point in a little while. I believe that Llywelyn ap Gruffudd particularly paid close attention to guarding the passes in and out of Eryri, Snowdonia, in part of his reign, but I think it's instructed that Dolbadan I will also draw your attention at the top of the map there to Dinorwig. That Dinorwig is within a stone's throw of Dolbadan. We'll mention that later too. But we also see, oh, I beg your pardon. Yes, I just want to make this point before we go on. Just how paltry Dolbadan's remains are. We're all familiar with it because of the massive round tower, which still stands very impressively overlooking the two lakes. But the rest of the castle is fragmentary, to say the least. That's what the South Tower looks like. That's barely there. And this is because, as we understand it, it's been dry stone. It's dry stone construction, so there's no mortar involved. I don't know enough about archaeology, but I would dearly like to wonder if that conclusion still holds true. I believe what happened is that the remains were consolidated in the early part of the 20th century using modern mortar. So that may well have masked any remaining mortar that was there. In any case, if it is indeed dry stone construction, there's only one good exemplar that I can think of, which is Carnfadrin on the Llyn Peninsula. which was erected, as far as we can determine, in the late 12th century. And I do start to wonder if this is Llywelyn's first attempt, as it were, using at that time what were the most current architectural principles of construction, and that he realized shortly after its completion that it just wouldn't do, and progressed to mortar castles such as the one in Llywelyn, such as the one in Caernarfon and Llywelyn, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But I also want to make the point that these early castles, Dolbadan, Abercaseg, Tintŵr, as it is also known in Bethesda, and so forth, I think it's worth pointing out where they are. And you know, they're right in the middle of northern Eryri, in this area of immense mythic importance for the princes. And I advanced this line of argument somewhat hesitantly, because we're talking about oral tradition here. And so, you know, we all know that that is fraught with difficulties. And I actually mentioned in the book that, you know, some of these traditions, you know, we really can't say very much about. Havod Gelyn, for example, number 4 on the map there, tucked away just below Abergwyngregin. Visited it on a couple of occasions when I lived in the area. This is a supposed residence of the princes. The remains that are visible there now date from the 17th century, and we have to invoke earlier remains if we are going to say that that goes back as far as the medieval period. We have Dol Dafydd, known to rugby fans in the Bethesda area. That's where the local rugby club play these days, which was recorded in the early modern period as a training camp of Dafydd ap Gruffudd in 1283. And Trefrw, not far from Llanrwst, where a church was reputedly built by Llywelyn ap Iorwerth for his Princess Siwan, or Joan. We need to be careful, obviously. These sorts of traditions often come to us late, and their provenance is uncertain. But there are just so very many of them in the area of the northern, the Caernarfon, these mountains in the far north of Eryri. And it just strikes me that linkage between the princes and the northern part of Eryri is very, very important. Remember, you know, it was used in their style for so long. Princeps Waliae Dominus Snowdon, the Prince of Wales, the Lord of Snowdon. You know, so there's this direct link in how the person is described between their ability to rule over a wide territory and their ability to rule directly over a relatively narrow territory, as Hugh Price points out in the Acts of Welsh Rulers. But we'll go on to, and I know Chris Jones-Jenkins is in the room. We've never met, but I'll just say chapeau, because this marvelous. I wonder how many of us had our imaginations fired by these types of illustrations. I certainly did in my teenage years when I first came across this really wonderful evocation of Llywelyn. So this is the castle that caused all the trouble. This is the one that Wilfred Hemp talked about and sort of damned with faint praise in his 1928 article, for reasons that are quite obvious by looking at it. You know, it's so very strange. It seems to violate every architectural principle of castle building that you can think of. We know, because we see it, you know, in movies and such, that castles ought to have the towers at the corners sticking out a little bit, so that they can provide enfilading fire to people who would attack on the linking walls. You know, you get fire on the tower to the left of you and to the right of you. But what we find here is a very poor enfilade effect from the circular tower at the top of the diagram, and the keep, the apsidal tower, which is in the foreground, isn't even on the curtain wall at all. It's actually within the upper ward. Ordinarily, you should have entrances which are you know, very heavily defended, for the obvious reason that they are the weak link. They're the easiest way to gain access to the castle. What do we have here? We have what would appear to be a bridge, and then just a simple entrance in the curtain without a tower next to it, or even a fighting platform over the top of it. And furthermore, the positioning of Llywelyn Castle is not very good in terms of being able to see attackers coming. You know, the sight lines are restricted on 3 sides. It's actually overlooked from above to the south. So this is a very strange castle, and Wilfred Hemp you know, made no attempt to sort of explain away those deficiencies, with the result, as I've said, that a lot of people just said that the Welsh princes didn't know how to build castles. As we now know, this previously anonymous castle was not built in 1257, as was thought by a long time. And the person responsible for this advance is David Stevenson, who 5 or 6 years ago published in Archaeologia Cambrensis an article in which he gave back to Iolo something of its history. He looked at the original document and noticed a mistranslation from the French. Somebody had, was it Cook, back in the 1890s, had mistranslated. And it didn't say that he built the castle in the corner of the wood in 1257. It said that he strengthened the castle or refurbished the castle. The word was mistranslated. So this castle clearly existed before Llywelyn ap Gruffudd did what he did to it in the late 1250s. Dr. Brodie suggests 1221 to 1237 as a possible period of construction. I think that's possible, but I favour an earlier one. This is a case of how we interpret the remains, and if we interpret the remains as not being militarily impressive, then we can place them later. But to my mind, this was meant in at least as an implicit threat to Ranulph, Earl of Chester. And so in that case, I would suggest it was probably built in the second decade of the 13th century, before Llywelyn and Ranulph became friends in 1218. And Stevenson's other insight here is that this almost certainly was erected in order to commemorate the victory of Owain Gwynedd over Henry II in the Battle of Iolo, the Battle of Coed Aelor, as J. Lloyd refers to it, in 1157. This was a big thing. In 1157, Henry II allied with Madog ap Meredydd and invaded Wales, and was faced down by Owain Gwynedd and his sons, Cynan and Dafydd, and an ambush was set somewhere in Tygengl in northeast Wales, as we thought, and the party of Henry II was ambushed in the woods. The Welsh fell on them, and Henry II escaped only with difficulty. His standard bearer was killed. Poems were written to commemorate warriors by Welsh poets at the time. It was a big thing. And there was also a battle in Moelfre at the same time, because Henry was trying a sort of pincer movement. He was invading from Chester, and he also sent ships to land on Ynys Môn, Anglesey, to sort of get Owain Gwynedd from two sides. And that was repelled as well in a battle. So this was obviously a big thing in Welsh history. Knowledge of it resonated for decades afterward, such that Llywelyn saw fit to build this castle in order to sort of commemorate the moment. So that may well have sort of tied his hands somewhat in terms of the location. I'm sure if he'd have had, if he was looking to build a castle for quote unquote military reasons, uncomplicatedly, he would have chosen a different site. But this represents a decent compromise between symbolism and military utility. The fact that it was overlooked to the south is not actually, it's not overlooked as badly as people point out, to my mind anyway, because to the immediate south, it would appear that the terrain has been sculpted, that we have a raised area, raised platform, which doesn't seem to be, natural. And it has been suggested that that is a siege work. So if we take that siege work away, then the sightlines to the castle look rather better than would be the case ordinarily. We are still left, of course, with the issue of this of the entrance. Now, we do see a lot of criticism by Hemp of Welsh castle entrances. They tend to be small openings in the curtain. But what we need to bear in mind is that the traffic to a lot of these castles was not likely to have been heavy. As far as we know, they were never used as mustering points for armies or anything of that sort. So it would seem that we don't need to worry about, Welsh princes didn't need to worry about that so much. But also, it may be the case that they formulated their own responses to the problem. And these responses were dictated by the limitations, the topographical limitations of the sites where they built their castles. So, there's the plan that we're looking at there. You see there that the West Tower, and you can see there it's actually linked to the rest of the curtain wall by a little link wall in grey. That's vanished now, but Wilfred Hemp was of the opinion that it existed. I think it existed. There is some architectural evidence in the Welsh Tower to suggest that it existed. And if that is indeed the case, as I believe it was, then we start to get a better idea for how the Welsh looked to defend their entrances. And I think it's important to point out that we have a very similar arrangement at several Welsh castles. Just take a look at this. We've got Iolo, we have Cricith, and we have Dolfodwyn. And in each case, the entrance, it would appear, is quite poorly sited, in as much as there is no overlooking tower on either side, and the entrance itself is relatively unsophisticated. But if we look at what attackers would have had to have done to get into the entrance at Iolo, they'd have got in with no trouble, and then they would have been faced by they would have been overlooked by archers and such on top of the Welsh Tower and firing from the slits of the Welsh Tower. There was a wall directly in front of them, the link wall, and so then in order to gain the rest of the castle, they'd had to run round the bottom part of the Welsh Tower and go round to the left-hand side of the upper ward, where they'd have been faced by a series of walls. So it strikes me that what the Welsh were doing there was they were trying to hem in their attackers. In other words, ceding ground so they could get them where they wanted them, rather than trying to keep them outside. In other words, we've got a kind of rudimentary gate passage here. A similar thing with Cricith. I'll point that out a little bit later. And in Dolfodwyn, we see the same thing. You know, the gateway presumably would have been quite easy to force, but then right in front of you is the long side of a very substantial keep. Again, you have to run to the left and round the side of the keep, being attacked all the time by archers and people throwing things and all that kind of thing. So I think we need to bear in mind that the native Welsh princes may well have formulated their own solutions to the problems of how to defend entrances, ones which may have seemed rather peculiar to Anglo-Norman eyes, but which seem to have worked perfectly well by the Welsh. So now we come on to the second phase of Welsh castle building. Remind me why I left Wales. I mean, I live in California now. I live in the Central Valley, which has all the topographical interest of it. I look at something like this and I just think, why? Why did I leave? And this demonstrates the point as well as anything I could possibly say, that Cricith is very, very visible. That is Cardigan Bay to the south. You can see Harlech in the middle distance. You know, the sight lines are unimpeded, just splendid. And by this point in Llywelyn's reign, Iorwerth's reign, he was, to my mind, starting to think about expressing his power more generally. The issue of his legitimacy was no longer in dispute, and so, to my mind, he began to build castles in order to enhance his own prestige. And I want to take us through the construction of this castle, simply because it does strike me as one of the most important architectural undertakings of any of the princes of Wales during the 13th century. We'll start off by the fact that Llywelyn was very open to influence from other places. We see this in terms of his attitude towards the succession, for example, overlooking his older son, Gruffudd, in favour of his younger son, Dafydd, because Gruffudd was illegitimate and Dafydd wasn't. That was not a problem in Welsh society, but he could see that that would be a problem So that willingness to go against tradition, I think, is worth speaking to. And this is Beeston Castle. Again, Dr. Swallow has done a great deal of work on this. And it's been suggested for a long time that Llywelyn took this as an exemplar when building. I'm going to throw into the mix another possibility. I don't really push this in the book, but I think it's probably worthwhile taking a second look at Whittington Castle there, which was captured by Llywelyn in the War of 1223. He returned it just a little while afterwards. but his interest in Whittington lordship lingered on. David Stevenson makes the point that it's possible that he made a formal claim or sought to formalize claims to Whittington lordship through a local family who had in the late 1230s, and that he actually married a daughter of Fulk Fitzwarren, who was the Lord of Whittington, just at the end of his life. This is not really talked about a great deal, but the Chester analyst, who's usually a pretty sober and good judge of what's going on in Wales, does mention it. And so it's an open question. Llywelyn would appear to have had designs on Whittington. Was this was the gatehouse in place at the time that he captured it in 1223? We don't quite know. It's not been securely dated beyond the 1220s, and so it is worth pointing out that maybe this was an exemplar as well. Is that any better in terms of sound? I see I'm dropping out a bit. Is that an improvement in terms of sound? I'm not getting a response. So I'll put the microphone back in. So yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that possibly Whittington Castle may have been an exemplar for Llywelyn in his construction of a cricket. We shall maybe there's more to be said on this. In any case, let's take a look at the layout, and this is just wonderful. For whoever it was who did this, I'm so sorry I didn't actually get to the attribution, but this can be found on YouTube. You really do get a feel for the bulk of cricket from this drone footage. And as the camera pans around, I'm just going to point something else out, which becomes important later on. There is the idea of the show facade. The principle that a lot of castles were built in order to look impressive, and so they would have one side of them which showed their bulk and on which we find the bulk of the defenses. Now, if we look at this, we're now on the northern side of the castle. So from that point of view, you'd see 1, 2, 3, 4 castles, the 2 square ones, rectangular ones in the front, and the 2 gatehouse ones as well. And that is like 90 or 100 meters long. So that would have demonstrated, the cricket's bulk very, very emphatically to travellers on the landward side. I think it's probably worth pointing that out before we get any further. So we're not quite sure when cricket was constructed. I tend to agree with Rachel Swallow that we've dated it perhaps a little bit late. It's been thought of as a construction of the 1230s. I think around about 1225 is probably more like it, simply because we have a reference to Gruffudd, Llywelyn's younger son. There he is. We have a reference to him in contemporary poetry. Einion ap Madog ap Rahawd refers to him as Pendefig Cricket Maith, the Lord of Extensive Cricket. If he was being described as a lord in a poem which was probably composed around about 1234, presumably cricket was already in existence and was quite impressive. Otherwise, why would you put it into your poem? And as Gruffudd was imprisoned from 1228 onwards in Conwy, I think we can safely say that it was round in the 1220s. Just before we go on to anything else, David is described by David Benbras as Llyw Dinorwig, the Lord of Dinorwig. So I wonder, it's something we can't really talk about in a very definite fashion, but do we start to get a feel for Llywelyn wanted to pass on hereditary lordships? Certainly, I think we can go as far as saying that he was trying to bestow upon each son an estate appropriate to his position. Dol Badan was augmented by that very impressive round tower. We don't know quite when, but consensus suggests towards the end of Llywelyn's reign. Was it done in order to provide David with his seat? I start to think that it was. Can't be sure, but if Gruffudd had cricket, David must have had somewhere. And Dol Badan is right in the heart of really at the wellsprings of Venedosian power. I think that is probably a reasonable inference to make. So that's how cricket looked at the beginning, with its inner gatehouse and inner ward and a southeast tower, probably meant as princely accommodation. And then the second phase appears. The outer ward is constructed. I mentioned the show facade, and then we've got the strange business of this this dog leg construction in the middle of the outer ward. It's very strange. A lot of historians don't even mention it or don't even show it on their maps. But I devoted a few thousand words in a piece for the Mortimer History Society journal a few years ago to discussing it. My feeling is that that is a part of the original construction, and that was meant to create a gate passage in the ward. So if we extend it onwards like this, you start to get a feel for how the weakness of the outer gatehouse is made good, again, within the castle itself. It would appear that the Welsh were happy to cede or happy to sort of invite attackers into the castle and then hold them up somewhere in order to pick them off at will. And you can see there that the southwest tower would have been overlooking this gate passage, and there were embrasures in there so people could fire projectiles at the assailants. It's not a perfect theory by any means, because we don't have any evidence that the wall met up with the southwest tower in any way. But if it did in some way, and I guess archaeological excavation could determine this, then that theory starts to gain credence. In any case, I just want to point it out again as a demonstration of how the Welsh princes were attentive to the needs of security with reference to the entrances of their castles. Look at that. Isn't that wonderful? That's Ivan Lapper's depiction. This would be after Edward I raised the gatehouse. He apparently extended the gatehouse by a level, but even so, it's very impressive, and you really get a feel for the. And the other corporate castle which I want to discuss is Abere, which shout out if you can spot it. It's actually right there in the middle of that clump of trees on a slight on a boss of rock in the middle of the Disynni Valley. I hesitated to include it as one of the corporate castles because it is so strangely. I can't pretend about this. I spend a lot of time sort of wringing my hands about it in the book. It's just in a very strange place. Unlike unlike Criccieth, which is overlooking the sea, unlike Deganwy, which is overlooking the sea, Conwy Bay and such, it's a few miles inland in the middle of the Disynni Valley. The river was navigable up to fairly close to Abere in the 13th century, but nevertheless, it doesn't seem to be guarding any important route. There is a route which runs through the Disynni Valley, but it doesn't seem to have been very important. In fact, it was so small that Edward I had to employ people to chop down trees to make it wide enough for Eleanor of Provence's carriage to make its way up the route in order to get to Abere in the 1280s. So it's a bit odd. Nevertheless, I've included it simply because, in terms of its scale, it really does match Criccieth and Deganwy for ambition. There's the defile, the Abergynolwyn defile, which a lot of people have suggested is the reason why it is placed as it is. I think that's a red herring, just because the defenders of Castell-Abere were half a mile away from an entrance to another valley doesn't explain why it was placed where it was. If it was meant to guard that far valley, why wasn't it put in that valley? Why was it put in this one instead? So it's strange. And the only way I can really think of rationalizing it is by invoking Dixon's idea of the castle as theatre. Another scholar, Ralph Maud, who wrote a piece on David ap Gruffudd, the first attempt really to rehabilitate that troubled prince's career that I saw in print. It appeared in the Cymrodorion some years ago, Transactions. And he was an unabashed stylist, was Ralph Maud. He wrote a great deal of purple prose and was very unapologetic about it. But one of the things that he suggests was that this is a sort of palace. This is the prince's palace. And the first time I read that many years ago, I kind of scoffed. How can you possibly say that? I start to wonder. This is a very impressive castle in terms of its architectural detailing. There is evidence of fine stonework found near the entrance. There was glass found, window glass, probably in the North Tower, the chapel tower, which suggests that that tower had lights, which was, usually an indication of luxury. We find evidence, the remains of floor tiles evoking work at Welsh monasteries. And then there are the high status finds that were found in archaeological excavations, including pieces of French pottery, which implies importation from France. So when you put all these things together and you look at the remarkable setting of Bere, I mean, you go to the ruins now, and it really is just beautifully sited. It just has such a wonderful panoramic view of the landscape in the Dysunny Valley. You can see a little bit of it there in that photograph. That photograph is taken in the middle of the ward, looking southwest. So you can see the middle tower there. That's the most prominent part of the ruins. I mean, look how far it is above the valley. That's the South Tower, which we'll talk about in a little while. All I will point out to you at the moment is that it is very, very badly ruined. It's the most ruined part of the entire castle. It's just got the barest footings still remaining. I'll talk about why that may be in a little while. You just see the bulk of the middle tower there in front of the round. So the idea of the castle as theatre, the idea is that you're meant to impress and overawe your visitors. And of course, this castle was not only very difficult to access, it was also in the middle of a marsh. There were marshes on three sides, as the Osley analyst tells us. And so you'd have to get to it through only maybe one or two routes. And one wonders if that was meant for effect as well. You're in the woods, and suddenly the woods disappear, and in front of you there's this imposing castle on the rock in front. And the other element that inclines me to think of this as a kind of a dramatic castle as theatre is the staircase. Look at the staircase in the plan there. Isn't it strange? Okay, we have intermural stairs in more or less every Welsh castle. Ewloe has them, Dolbadan has them, but in this case we've got a staircase which is just sticking out into the ward for no apparent reason. It doesn't serve any sort of defensive function. It's not clear why it's there. And the other strange thing about it is that they had two goes at it. So if you actually walk up the staircase now, you'll get to the top, and then there's a small level platform, and then you're looking down into another staircase. Okay, and this staircase was buried by the first staircase, as it were. So for whatever reason, somebody said, no, stop making that one. I want a bigger one. It's just so strange, and that kind of false start is very, very unusual in any castle, really. Dave Hopewell, in his excavations of Caernarfon, has spotted that the entrance may have been tried twice. That there may have been a sort of botched job to begin with, and they had another go at it. But there are very few other examples, and I do wonder if that is a response to the need for ostentation and the need to create, a sophisticated entrance into the North Tower, probably the Chapel Tower. And we have that the suggestion that there's a platform in front of the North Tower there. You can see that peculiar second wall just to the right of the staircase. That has been suggested as the Warfare of Maltex. I think maybe there was a balcony there or a terrace. And so that allowed visitors, that was the sort of the climax of their visit, to go there and then to look out at this landscape, which the prince controlled in the most visceral fashion, and the castle in the middle of it. We can't know, obviously. I suggest that as a theory, but I think it's worth thinking about. We can't suggest it with certainty, but it would have the advantage of explaining why this really opulent castle was placed in this weird location where it doesn't really discharge any sort of military function. So then we come to Llywelyn. How am I doing for time, by the way? I'm not quite sure. Just give me a shout if I'm talking for too long. I'm not too far off now. We come to Llywelyn II, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, and the defense of Wales. I'm just going to talk a little bit about his reign before we get any further, because it is important. He came to power in 1246 after the death of Dafydd ap Llywelyn, defeated his brothers Dafydd and Owain at Bryn Derwin in 1255, and was styled Principality from 1258. So his reign is, J. Beverley Smith refers to his reign as a principality in perplexity. And I think that's just a wonderful way of putting it, that he spends so much of his time trying to establish the legitimacy, not amongst the Welsh lords, but from the King of England, who is the person he is most concerned with gaining recognition from. And he finally did get recognition in the Treaty of Montgomery. But as David Stevenson has pointed out, there is more than a hint that this is when the rot set in, because it involved him paying onerous amounts of money to Henry III, which he fell behind on his payments. And by the time we get to 1276, Edward I loses his patience, washes his hands of him, and invades Wales. Llywelyn surrendered at the treaty at Aberconwy and was stripped of much of his power. A second war began in 1982, probably instigated by Dafydd ap Gruffudd, and Llywelyn was killed at Kilmerry. So Llywelyn was also a very active castle builder. And to return to this map here, I think it's worth pointing out where he built his castles, or where we have evidence of his works. So he refurbished Ewloe in the northeast. We know he gained control of a mould. He would appear to have been the instigator of Dinas Bran in cooperation with the princes of Powys, the lords of Powys. He erected Dolforwyn, almost certainly erected Bryn Amlwg, and refurbished Abera and extended Crickeath. But look at that kind of arc of castles down the eastern border of Wales. And if we actually extend the map southwards, I'll just point out Sennybridge as well in the south. And if you really wanted to push the point, we could talk about Castell Morgraig in Senghenydd, which was erected in the 1260s and was never finished. It's a really strange looking castle. It doesn't look like an Anglo-Norman castle particularly, and it does have large numbers of apsidal towers and rock-cut ditches, just like a Welsh castle would. I shy away from the final hurdle in the book. I don't say Llywelyn built that or sponsored it, but I'm starting to come around to that opinion. And if that is the case, then it would also give a good explanation, or at least would add credence to the idea that his campaigns in Senghenydd at the very end of the 1260s were important to him in terms of the territory that he went on to control. But I mean, we can't say for certain that this is what's going on. I mean, there is the kind of, we could run into a logical fallacy here, because of course the eastern territories were the ones he was moving into anyway, and so maybe it's not indicative of anything that he's building castles in these areas. But build castles he did, and one is given to wonder if this occurred because he was trying to make the Principality defensible. If he was, he didn't make a very good job of it. And the suggestion that I make in the book is that he ran out of money, which we'll come to in a little while. The castle architecture changes subtly at this point. And Dr. Brodie has made the very perceptive comment that we find a shift in the purpose of castles occurring in the later part of the 13th century for the Welsh princes. In the early part of the 13th century, we see the apsidal tower, referred to as the D-shaped tower. People aren't really distinguishing between the two ordinarily in castle architecture. It was Dr. Brodie who suggested that we ought to, that there's a difference between an apsidal tower and a D-shaped tower. D-shaped towers being smaller, more squashed, and not fulfilling the dual function that was so important with the apsidal tower. Apsidal towers are created because they've got a circular end, which you could, point at the field, which would allow archers a wide range of fire, but they've got a square bottom end so that they maximize floor space. And so you could put accommodation in them and they could have a defensive function at the end. So that's what the Welsh were doing with apsidal towers. They were killing two birds with one stone. By the time we get to the later castles, like Dinas Bran, like Dolforwyn, and like Bryn Amlwg, which I really am inclined to think was a Welsh construction, D-shaped towers are it. We have these semicircular towers, and that's all they're doing. They're there to provide defense. There's very little floor space in them. Nobody's going to be living in them or using them for administrative purposes. They're there for defense first and foremost. And I think that's worth pointing out as well. So there's Llywelyn's position in 1276 at the outbreak of the war. Dolforwyn, I spent some time on it in the book, was certainly not finished. we have some accounts for it. We know it was begun around about 1273, and that over £100 of money was spent on it. But it seems that it was not finished. For example, a well wasn't dug. And that was a big thing in Welsh castles. I make the point in the book that Welsh castles would appear to have been far better served by water sources than has been the case. Again, it's a constant criticism of the native princes. Well, they didn't include wells, so how could these castles have been designed to withstand sieges? Well, in fact, lots of them did have water sources in them. Dolforwyn has natural water sources in it, stones which could be tapped for water, aquiferous stones which could be tapped for water. There is also the suggestion of the same at Dolbadan. You don't find it on in the guides, but the initial survey, which was carried out in the 1930s, does actually show, quote unquote, a well next to the round tower. I think it's likely what was there was some sort of stone which the surveyor felt could be tapped for water. We have a well in Dinas Bran, we have a well in Eula, we have a well in Cricketh. So this is a far more, I think the Welsh princes were very much alert to this issue. But in Dolforwyn, there wasn't one. And so this points out that one of the first things the English did when they took over was to dig a well. So this points out that it was not finished. And we also have the business of the South Tower in Abere. And I mentioned that is the most ruined part of Abere. And it always bothered me that it was the part of the castle which, as far as we can determine, was not connected to the rest of the castle. There's actually an empty space between the South Tower and the rest of Castle Abere. Very strange. The first thing Edward I did when he captured the castle was to build link walls, to make sure that there was communication. And it's been suggested, Paul R. Davis suggested that it was meant as, the final bastion, that if the rest of the castle fell, the defenders could retreat to the South Tower. To my mind, that doesn't make any sense. Not the least of the reasons for that is that the entrance to it is on the ground floor. So if you're going to use that as a last line of defense, why would you introduce this inherent weakness in the architecture on the ground floor? It seems to me that what happened was that Llywelyn ran out of money, and that if there were link walls in place, they were very flimsy, or we're just talking about wooden palisades or something of that nature. And it would also account, possibly, for the fact that it is so badly ruined. Bryn Amlwg, which you see at the bottom of the map here, was also very badly ruined when it's excavated. Very few people know about it. Only the footings remain. And there is very, very little limestone to be found. Most of the limestone in it can be found in the double gatehouse, and what mortar is there has got very little lime in it. So it seems like my suggestion is that Llywelyn's builders were starting to skimp on materials because they were short of cash. Now, again, I'm going to freely admit, other interpretations are available, and I know that David Stevenson in particular has some disagreement with me in terms of Llywelyn's finances, and that maybe he had access to more money than might have been the case. We can't quite know that yet, but I think it is. I think it's interesting and provocative to point out that the mortar and the construction of so many of Llywelyn's final castles was substandard. And to my mind, this speaks to somebody who's trying to spread themselves too thinly and come here proper as a result. But we see again attentiveness to control of the territory. That's Dinas Bran, looking out to the east over the Shropshire plain. There's the viewshed analysis. You can see, it's very, very visible. And indeed is looking over parts of Shropshire which were under Llywelyn's aegis for a long time. But when we come to the final point, I'm just finishing now. This is how Gwynedd looked at the very end of Llywelyn's reign. We can't know how many of these towers and fortifications were garrisoned in the wars of 1276-77 or 1282-83. But I'll put it to you that a great number of them were. And that my principal reason for thinking this is that Edward I, after he conquered Wales, spent so much time visiting them. Now we can explain away that with Caernarfon, with Cricketh, with Abere and so forth, because Edward saw fit to retain these locations, and Cricketh was extended, A new camera or chamber was built at Abera. Caernarfon, we know what was built there. So it makes a lot of sense to see him visiting these places repeatedly. It makes no sense whatsoever to find him visiting Aber Caseg in Bethesda, which he did in 1284, if I remember rightly. We have a good idea of his route because his itinerary survives. And the day before, he is not in the Nant-Francon Valley. He was in the Llanberis Valley, on his way, so it seems, towards Caernarfon, where he arrived at a day or two later. But in the meantime, he spent a night at Aber Caseg. This is very strange. He would have had to have left the Llanberis Valley, maybe going north in the direction of the Menai Straits, marched eastward away from his final destination at Caernarfon, and then marched into the Nant-Francon Valley in order to visit Aber Caseg. Why? Why did he care? It's a very strange thing to find him going to such an insignificant place, a place which is not storied. You know, we have no history behind this masonry tower, which we find at Aber Caseg. And the only thing I can think of is that he was interested in it because it was the site of recent fighting. Why else go? You know, he was not the sort of person who was given to sort of sightseeing, as it were. And I have to wonder. It is strange. And I'll also point out that, that there are good reasons for thinking also that Facade was fortified, and Caernarfon as well. Caernarfon does not feature in his itinerary, but Llywelyn does feature in his itinerary, and that is the closest village. So maybe he was staying at Caernarfon. In any case, I'll leave it there. Thank you.